My name is Quinn Tremblay. I am 36 years old, a licensed structural engineer, and a single mother of 4-year-old twin boys. And 2 months ago I was lying on a gurney in the back of an ambulance, watching my own blood pressure drop on a monitor I knew how to read, because I had spent enough nights in hospitals to understand exactly how bad the numbers were getting. My abdomen felt like something had been set on fire inside it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock my phone. But I called my parents anyway because that is what you do when you are terrified and bleeding and your 2 little boys are at home with a sitter who had to leave by 7:30. My father picked up on the 3rd ring. I told him what happened. I told him I needed them to go to the house just for a few hours, just until I knew what was happening to me. There was a pause on the line. Then I heard my mother's voice in the background, sharp and annoyed, and then the sound of my sister Ivy laughing at something on the television. My father came back on and told me they had plans. He said, and I want you to remember these exact words because I have not forgotten them for a single day since. He said, "Quinn, you're always so dramatic. You'll be fine. Figure it out." Then he hung up. I want you to stay with me through this story because what happened next, what my grandfather did when he found out, is something I still think about every single morning when I wake up. The stories like this one speak to you. If you have ever been the one who gave everything and got nothing back, please take a second right now to subscribe. I put everything into these stories and your support means more than I can say. Now let me take you back to the beginning because this did not start in that ambulance. This started a very long time ago in a house in Briarwick, Kentucky, where I learned before I was old enough to ride a bike that some children in a family are loved, and some are simply useful. Growing up in the Tremblay household meant growing up in 2 completely different houses depending on who you were. If you were Ivy, the younger one, the prettier one, the one who made our mother cry happy tears just by walking into a room, then home was warm and golden and full of applause. If you were me, home was a place where you learned to need less, ask for less, and be grateful for whatever small portion of attention happened to fall your way on any given day. I understood this dynamic before I had the words to describe it. I felt it in the way my parents talked about Ivy's dance recitals versus my academic awards. I felt it in the way my father's face changed when Ivy called versus when I called. Hers lit him up. Mine seemed to inconvenience him. I told myself the usual things children tell themselves to survive that kind of household. I told myself that I was the strong one, the independent one, and that needing less was actually a virtue. I threw myself into school with the kind of focused desperation that only makes sense when you understand that achievement is the only currency you have. I graduated at the top of my class, earned a full scholarship to the University of Kentucky, completed my engineering degree in 4 years, passed my licensure exams on the first attempt, and built a career that by every external measure looked like a success story. My parents came to my graduation. My father nodded and said it was practical. My mother asked when Ivy's graduation party invitations needed to go out. Ivy had dropped out of her fine arts program the previous semester, but that was not the point. The point was that Ivy still mattered more regardless of what either of us had actually done. The financial piece came later and it came quietly, the way these things always do in families where one person has been trained not to say no. It started 7 years ago when my father called me one evening with that particular tightness in his voice that I later came to recognize as the setup for a request. He told me they were behind on the mortgage. Just this once, he said. It was always just this once. I transferred the money that same night without a single question, because they were my parents and I had spent my entire life trying to earn something from them that I could not even name. Just this once became the first of every month. The mortgage was $2,200. Then my mother needed dental work that their insurance would not cover. Then the car needed a transmission. Then Ivy's rent was late because her gallery job was not paying what she expected, and could I just help her out for a few months until she got on her feet? I kept a spreadsheet. I do not know what made me start it. Maybe some quiet, practical part of my brain understood even then that I was going to need the evidence someday. I logged every transfer, every amount, every date. Month after month, year after year. The numbers grew in a column on my laptop that I almost never opened because looking at it felt like pressing on a bruise. When I got pregnant with the twins and their father decided that fatherhood was not the life he had envisioned for himself, I called my parents from the doctor's office, still holding the ultrasound image, still trying to process the fact that I was doing this alone. My mother said, "Oh honey," and then asked if I had told Ivy yet because Ivy would want to know. My father said I had always been capable and he was sure I would manage. They did not come when the boys were born. They sent a card. The automatic transfers kept going out like clockwork. I managed because I had no other choice and because I had spent my entire life being told that managing was the highest form of love I was allowed to expect from myself. I hired a nanny, rearranged my project schedules, nursed 2 babies in the early hours of the morning before getting on calls with contractors at 7 a.m., and kept sending money to a family that responded to my existence with the same mild inconvenience they might feel toward a slow elevator. The accident happened on a Wednesday evening in late October. I was driving home from a site inspection, tired but alert, and the intersection light had just turned green when a delivery truck ran the red at full speed and caught the rear driver's side of my car with enough force to spin me across 2 lanes. I remember the sound more than anything else. Metal and glass, and then a silence so complete it felt like being underwater. I came back to consciousness with a paramedic's face above me and a pain in my side so specific and so wrong that my engineering brain immediately began calculating what internal structures could produce that particular sensation. The paramedic told me her name was Rosa. She told me I had been in an accident and that they were taking me in. I told her my boys were at home with a sitter who left at 7:30 and I needed someone to make a call. She handed me my phone without hesitation. I dialed my father first. You already know how that ended. After he hung up, I lay there for what felt like a long time but was probably 30 seconds, staring at the cracked corner of my phone screen, listening to the ambulance moving through traffic. Then something shifted in me. Not dramatically, not like a movie moment. More like a gear that had been grinding for years finally slipping into a different position. I opened my contacts and called a backup sitter I had used twice before, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Aldridge who had once told me to call her anytime, day or night, if I ever needed someone for the boys. She answered on the second ring. She said she would be there in 15 minutes. She asked if I was all right. I told her the truth, which was that I did not know yet. The surgery took just under 3 hours. A lacerated spleen, internal bleeding significant enough that the attending later told me another 20 minutes without intervention would have put me in a genuinely different category of outcome. I spent 4 days in the hospital. My parents did not call. Ivy sent a text on day 3 that said hope you feel better soon, followed by a photo of a dress she was considering buying. I read it once and set the phone face down on the blanket. On the second night, when the morphine had worn down enough that I could think clearly, I asked a nurse for my laptop. She gave me the same look nurses give patients who ask for things they probably should not have yet, but she brought it anyway. I logged into my bank account. 7 years of transfers looked back at me from the screen, steady and faithful as a heartbeat, every single month without exception. I sat with that for a moment. Then I canceled every recurring payment one by one until the screen showed nothing but silence. It was the easiest thing I had done in 7 years. I did not cry. I did not feel the surge of satisfaction I might have expected after years of quiet resentment building behind a wall I had been too dutiful to tear down. What I felt was something far simpler and far more unfamiliar. I felt the specific physical sensation of putting down a weight I had been carrying for so long that I had stopped noticing it was there. The room was quiet. The monitors beeped steadily. Down the hall, somewhere in the hospital, other people's families were sitting in waiting rooms. Mine was not. And for the first time in a very long time, that fact did not surprise me at all. I was discharged on a Thursday morning. The attending physician, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Reyes, walked me through my recovery instructions with the careful thoroughness of someone who had learned not to assume patients would follow up properly. No heavy lifting for 6 weeks. No returning to active job sites for at least a month. Rest, fluids, and a follow-up appointment in 10 days. I nodded through all of it, signed the discharge papers, and walked out of the hospital into a gray Kentucky morning with a prescription in my hand and 4 days of accumulated silence from my family sitting in my chest like a stone. Mrs. Aldridge had kept the boys the entire time I was in the hospital. She had not asked me once when I was coming home. She had simply sent photos twice a day, the boys eating breakfast, the boys watching cartoons, the boys asleep in a tangle on her guest bed, their dark hair fanned out across the pillow in that boneless, total way that only small children can sleep. When I walked through her front door and Owen ran at me full speed and buried his face in my stomach, I had to bite down hard on the inside of my cheek to keep from falling apart completely. Eli, the quieter of the two, just took my hand and held it and did not let go for the rest of the afternoon. I paid Mrs. Aldridge double what we had agreed on. She tried to refuse it. I told her it was non-negotiable. She looked at me for a long moment with the particular expression of a woman who had seen enough of the world to understand when an argument was not worth having, and she folded the money into her cardigan pocket without another word. The first week home was slow and strange. I was not accustomed to stillness. My entire adult life had been constructed around motion, around the next deadline, the next project, the next task that needed doing before I could allow myself to rest. Sitting on my couch with a heating pad against my side while the boys played on the floor felt like wearing clothes that did not fit. My phone sat on the coffee table. My parents did not call. Ivy did not call. The group chat my mother had created 3 years ago for what she called family updates, which in practice meant a steady stream of photos of Ivy at various social events and the occasional forwarded recipe, had gone completely quiet since the night of the accident. I noticed the silence the way you notice a sound that has suddenly stopped. 4 years I had been the one reaching across the distance in that family, the one sending check-in messages, the one calling on birthdays, the one asking how everyone was doing while quietly depositing money into their accounts at the beginning of every month. Now that I had stopped, the silence revealed something I had probably always known but never allowed myself to look at directly. The connection had never been mutual. It had been a service I was providing. And now that the service had stopped, there was simply nothing there. On the 5th day home my father called. I watched his name on the screen through 4 full rings and then let it go to voicemail. He left a message. His voice was controlled, with that particular strain underneath it that I recognized as Douglas Tremblay doing his best impression of a reasonable man. He said he had heard I was home and that he was glad I was okay. He said he hoped there were no hard feelings about the other night, that they had not understood the situation was as serious as it apparently was. He used the word apparently twice. He said Marlene sent her love. He did not mention the missed mortgage payment that would have been due 4 days after I canceled the transfer. He did not mention it, but I knew that was the real reason he had called. I saved the voicemail to a folder I created on my phone and labeled it simply, Record. I had already transferred my spreadsheet to a printed document while I was still in the hospital. Every payment, every date, every amount going back 7 full years. The total, when I added it up properly for the first time and stopped avoiding the bottom line, was $311,000. I had run that number 3 times because the first 2 times I assumed I had made an arithmetic error. I had not. $311,000, sent in careful monthly increments to a family that had responded to my medical emergency with the words "figure it out" and a disconnected line. I put the printed document in a plain manila envelope and set it in the drawer of my bedside table. I did not know exactly what I was going to do with it yet. But I had learned enough from 7 years of working in structural engineering to understand that you do not begin demolition without first making sure you have the documentation in order. The call that changed the direction of everything came 11 days after I got home. It was a Sunday evening and I was sitting at the kitchen table helping Owen with the shape-sorting puzzle that he had been aggressively dedicated to for the past week when my phone rang with a number I did not immediately recognize. An area code I placed after a moment as coming from Harlan County, which was about 2 hours southeast of Briarwick, deeper into the hills. I answered it more out of curiosity than expectation. Quinn. The voice on the other end was elderly, deliberate, and carried the unhurried weight of a man who had never once in his life felt the need to speak faster than he intended to. It's your grandfather. It's Walter. I set down the puzzle piece I was holding. Walter Tremblay. My father's father. 81 years old. A former county court judge who had served on the bench for 38 years before his retirement, and who had been kept at a careful distance from me by my parents for as long as I could remember. When I was a child, visits to Grandpa Walter's house in Harlan County had been rare and always slightly tense in a way I could not understand at the time. As I got older, the visits stopped entirely. My parents always had reasons. Too far, too busy, the boys were too young for a long drive. I had not spoken to Walter Tremblay in almost 4 years. Grandpa. My voice came out smaller than I intended. How did you get my number? Your cousin Delia. He said it plainly without apology. She called me last week. Told me what happened. I was quiet for a moment, recalibrating. Delia was my father's niece through a different branch of the family, sharp and no-nonsense and one of the few relatives I had always genuinely liked. I had not spoken to her since Christmas 2 years ago. What exactly did she tell you? I asked. Enough. There was a pause, and in the pause I heard something I was not expecting from a man I barely knew anymore. I heard controlled anger. Not hot anger, not the dramatic kind. The cold, compressed kind that sits in a person for a long time before it finally surfaces. She told me about the accident. She told me about the phone call you made from that ambulance. She told me what your father said to you. I did not respond. Quinn, I want to ask you something and I want you to answer me honestly. His voice was measured and precise. The voice of a man who had spent nearly 4 decades asking questions from a position of authority and could tell immediately when an answer was incomplete. How long has this been going on? Not just the accident. The money. All of it. I looked across the table at Owen, who had given up on the puzzle and was now attempting to balance a shape piece on top of his head with tremendous concentration. Eli was on the floor nearby, quietly lining up his toy trucks in a row by color. 2 small boys in a kitchen in Briarwick, Kentucky, who had no idea that their mother had spent the better part of a decade funding a household that did not include them. 7 years, I said. The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that I checked my screen to make sure the call had not dropped. I see. 2 words. But the weight inside them was considerable. I want you to do something for me. I want you to pull together every record you have. Every transfer, every date, every amount. Can you do that? I already have, I said. Another pause. Good girl. He said it the way he must have said it when I was 6 years old, and he still saw me regularly, before the distance my parents had constructed between us had grown wide enough to feel permanent. Something about the phrase landed in a place I had not expected and sat there quietly. My birthday is in 3 weeks, Walter said. I'll be 82. The family is gathering here in Harlan County. Your father and mother will be there. Ivy will be there. Most of the extended family on both sides. He paused. I would very much like you to come. And I would like you to bring those records. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling for a moment, thinking about what he was suggesting. What he was not quite saying but was communicating with the precision of a man who had spent his career understanding the difference between what was stated and what was meant. What are you planning to do, Grandpa? I asked. His answer was quiet and unhurried and utterly certain. I'm going to make sure this family knows the truth. All of it. In the right setting with the right people present. A beat. I spent 38 years on that bench, Quinn. I know how to present facts. And I know what happens to people when the facts are finally laid out in front of them somewhere they cannot walk away from. I looked at my boys. Owen had successfully balanced the shape piece on his head and was now frozen in triumph, waiting for someone to notice. Eli had finished his truck lineup and was surveying it with quiet satisfaction. I'll be there, I said. The 2 weeks between Walter's phone call and his birthday were the quietest I had experienced in years, and not in the way quiet usually felt to me. Usually quiet meant falling behind. It meant something was being neglected, some deadline creeping closer while I wasn't paying attention, some obligation I had temporarily set aside that would eventually need to be picked back up. This quiet was different. It felt deliberate. Like the stillness before a structure is stress-tested, when everything is in place and the only thing left is to find out what holds and what doesn't. I spent the first few days of that period doing something I had never allowed myself to do properly before. I went through every single financial record I had, not just the summary I had already printed but the full paper trail. Bank statements, transfer confirmations, the email receipts from the insurance company that showed my name as the account holder on my parents' health coverage. I had 7 years of documentation stored across 2 email accounts, a physical folder in my filing cabinet, and the spreadsheet I had been quietly updating every month like a bookkeeper who worked for a company she was also personally financing. I organized everything chronologically and compiled it into a single binder, tabbed and indexed the way I would organize documentation for a major engineering project. It took me the better part of 3 days. When I was finished, I sat at my kitchen table and looked at what I had assembled. The binder was 2 inches thick. Inside it was the financial autobiography of a family arrangement that had never been named, never been negotiated, and never once been acknowledged by the people who benefited most from it. My parents had a comfortable house in Briarwick because of transfers that went out from my account on the 1st of every month. They had health coverage because I had picked up the bill without being asked when my father's employer dropped their plan 5 years ago. They had a reliable vehicle because I had quietly covered 2 separate repair bills that together totaled just under $9,000. And Ivy, who had spent years positioning herself as the family's creative talent and financial underdog, had received $11,000 in direct support from me over the course of 4 years. Money she had asked for in small increments and casual language that made each individual request seem reasonable in isolation but added up to something considerably less casual when you saw the full column. I did not feel righteous looking at the binder. I want to be clear about that because I think people expect a moment like that to feel like a revelation, like something dramatic finally snapping into focus. What I actually felt was tired. The specific exhaustion of a person who has finally stopped pretending that a situation is something other than what it is. My cousin Delia came over 4 days before the birthday gathering. She was 39, worked as a paralegal in Lexington, and had the kind of direct conversational style that could feel abrasive until you understood it was simply the absence of performance. She had driven 2 hours to sit at my kitchen table and drink coffee and look through the binder, and she did not say anything for a long time after she closed it. "Quinn," she finally said, "do you understand that what's in here constitutes grounds for a civil claim in this state?" I told her I had not thought about it in those terms. "You should." She tapped the cover of the binder. "I'm not saying you have to go that route. But you should understand what you're actually holding." She looked at me steadily. "Your grandfather called me after he talked to you. He wanted to know if I'd come to the gathering. Are you going to?" "I drove 2 hours on a Wednesday to sit in your kitchen," she said. "What do you think?" Delia stayed for dinner and helped me put the boys to bed, and afterward we sat on the back porch while the October air came in cool and smelling of wood smoke from somewhere down the street. She told me that she had watched the dynamic in our family for years from the outside edge of it, close enough to see it clearly but far enough removed that no one had ever thought to manage her perception of it the way they managed everyone else's. "Your father is a proud man," she said. "And proud men who have been caught doing something they know is indefensible don't apologize. They reframe. They make the person who caught them into the problem." She turned to look at me. "He's going to come at you before that gathering even starts. He's been calling around. My mother told me he called her last week, very casual, just checking in, mentioning that you had been through a lot and seemed to be struggling." I looked out at the dark yard. "Laying groundwork. Preparing the room," Delia said. "So that when the truth comes out, there's already a competing narrative in place." She paused. "He doesn't know about the binder. He doesn't know what Walter has planned. But he knows something is coming and he's trying to get ahead of it." I thought about that for a while. The engineering part of my brain, the part that spent its days anticipating structural failure before it happened, understood exactly what my father was doing. You do not wait for a load-bearing wall to crack and then explain yourself. You predistribute the stress. You make sure that when the collapse comes, the blame is already elsewhere. "Let him prepare," I said. "The documentation doesn't change." Delia looked at me with something that might have been satisfaction. "No," she said. "It doesn't." The drive to Harlan County took just under 2 hours on a Saturday morning. I had packed the boys' overnight bag the night before and set it by the door alongside the binder, which I had wrapped in a plain brown paper bag because I did not want to explain it to Owen, who had recently become very interested in asking what things were and why they were there. I had told the boys we were going to see their great-grandfather's house for his birthday, and Owen had asked if there would be cake, and I had told him almost certainly yes, and that had been the end of his questions. Walter Tremblay's property sat at the end of a gravel road that wound up into the hills east of town. The house was old, solidly built, white clapboard with green shutters and a deep porch that ran the full length of the front. It looked like what it was, which was the home of a man who had lived in the same place for 50 years and had seen no reason to change what was working. There were already a dozen cars in the gravel lot when I pulled in, and through the front windows I could see movement and light and the shapes of people I had not seen in years. I sat in the car for a moment after I turned off the engine. Owen was already trying to get out of his car seat and Eli was watching me with his quiet, attentive eyes in the rearview mirror. "Mama okay?" Eli asked. "Yes, baby," I said. "Mama's okay." I got them out of the car and took Eli's hand and carried Owen on my hip because he had decided without discussion that this was the current arrangement, and I walked up the porch steps with the binder in the brown paper bag hanging from my free hand. Walter was waiting at the door. He was taller than I remembered, or maybe it was just the authority he carried in his posture, that particular uprightness that some people develop over decades of being the person in the room that others defer to. His hair was fully white now and his face had deepened into new lines, but his eyes were the same pale gray I remembered from childhood, clear and watchful and entirely present. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at my boys, and something in his expression shifted into a warmth that he did not appear to extend toward everyone. Quinn. He stepped forward and put his hand on my shoulder firmly, the way you hold something you have been concerned about losing. I'm glad you came. I almost didn't, I admitted. I know. He glanced at the brown paper bag. Is that it? Yes. He took it from me carefully, the way you handle something that matters, and held it for a moment. Then he looked back at me with an expression that was not quite a smile but carried the same weight as one. I want you to go inside and greet the family, he said. Eat something. Let the boys run around. Don't engage with your father or your mother tonight, regardless of what they say to you. His voice was quiet enough that only I could hear it. Let them talk. Let them set up whatever they're planning. Tomorrow morning after breakfast, when everyone is still here and comfortable, that is when we have the conversation. He paused. Can you do that? I thought about the past 7 years. I thought about the spreadsheet and the binder and the voicemail I had saved to a folder called Record. I thought about lying on a gurney in an ambulance listening to my father tell me to figure it out. I thought about Eli asking if Mama was okay from the back seat of a car in a gravel parking lot in Harlan County. Yes, I said. I can do that. Walter nodded slowly. Then he stepped aside and held the door open, and I walked into the house carrying my son on my hip while my other son held my hand, and somewhere inside the warm light of that old house, my parents did not yet know that the last night of their carefully constructed story had already begun. The inside of Walter's house smelled like pine wood and coffee and the particular warmth of a space that had held generations of the same family across enough decades to absorb something of all of them. The living room was large by the standards of the house, low-ceilinged and lined with bookshelves, a stone fireplace at one end burning steadily against the October chill. Folding tables had been set up along one wall with food on them, the kind of spread that only happens when multiple people have been cooking since early morning. There were probably 30 people already inside, and more voices were coming from the back of the house where the kitchen opened onto a rear porch. I stood in the doorway for a moment and let myself take inventory the way I always did when I entered a space I needed to understand quickly. Aunt Patrice near the fireplace, my father's older sister, who I had always liked but rarely seen. A cluster of cousins I recognized from childhood standing near the food table. Walter's neighbor and longtime friend, a man named Garrett whose last name I had never learned, sitting in the corner armchair with a glass of something amber. And then across the room near the window, my parents. My father saw me at almost the same moment I saw him. Douglas Tremblay was 63 years old. A broad-shouldered man who had spent most of his life expecting rooms to adjust themselves to his presence rather than the other way around. He had the look of someone who had prepared for this moment and was now recalibrating slightly because the moment had arrived and I did not look the way he had expected me to look. I was not hesitant. I was not fragile. I had my son on my hip and my other son's hand in mine, and I was standing in a doorway in my grandfather's house the same way I stood on job sites, which was like someone who belonged there. My mother was beside him. Marlene Tremblay was a small woman who had spent 60 years perfecting the art of looking wounded as a preemptive strategy. She had the handkerchief ready. I noticed it before she even looked up, already tucked into the sleeve of her cardigan, already positioned. She met my eyes and her expression shifted through 3 different things in about 2 seconds: surprise, calculation, and then something that assembled itself into the approximate shape of maternal hurt. I nodded at both of them without stopping and walked further into the room to find somewhere to settle the boys. Ivy found me 20 minutes later. I was in the kitchen refilling Owen's juice cup when she appeared in the doorway with the particular energy of someone who has been building toward a conversation for a while and has finally decided to have it. My sister was 33, 2 years younger than me, and she had the kind of surface confidence that worked well in rooms where nobody looked too closely. She was dressed in something that probably cost more than my monthly utility bills, and her hair was done with the careful casualness that takes considerable effort to achieve. Quinn. She said my name like it was the opening move in a chess game. I didn't know if you'd actually come. Here I am, I said. She leaned against the counter and lowered her voice. I think we should talk before things get weird. Mom and Dad are really hurt. Whatever you think happened, you have to understand that cutting off all contact the way you did, blocking their numbers, stopping the transfers without a single conversation, that was a shock to them. I looked at her steadily. Ivy, I was in an ambulance. I know, and that was terrible, and I'm glad you're okay. She said it quickly, the way you say something you have practiced saying. But you have to understand that they didn't realize how serious it was. Dad thought you were being dramatic. He felt terrible when he found out. Did he call the hospital? She paused. What? In the 4 days I was admitted. Did he call the hospital to check on me? The pause stretched a half-second too long. Things were complicated. Did you? She straightened slightly. Quinn, I'm trying to help you here. Grandpa Walter has clearly gotten some version of events that isn't complete, and if you walk into whatever he's planning tomorrow without giving Mom and Dad a chance to explain their side, this is going to turn into something that damages this family in ways that can't be undone. I put the juice cup down on the counter and turned to face her fully. Ivy, how much money have I sent you over the past 4 years? The question landed the way I intended it to, which was without warning and without room to maneuver around. Her expression shifted. Something moved behind her eyes that was not quite guilt but was in the neighborhood of it. That's not relevant to what I'm saying. It's relevant to what I'm saying. I picked the juice cup back up. I'll see you in the morning. I walked back out to the living room before she could respond. The evening passed in the careful way that evenings pass when a room full of people is collectively aware that something is underneath the surface of everything but has collectively agreed not to name it until morning. I ate. I watched the boys charm 3 different great aunts in sequence. I talked to Aunt Patrice for 20 minutes about her garden and a home renovation project she had been managing, and it was the most straightforward conversation I had in years because Patrice had no agenda and no performance and simply talked to me like a person. Walter moved through the room at his own pace, unhurried and deliberate, spending time with everyone, never staying in one place long enough to signal that anything particular was being planned. My father made his move at 9 o'clock. After most of the younger children had been put to bed and the gathering had settled into the quieter register of adult conversation and the last of the dessert plates being cleared. He positioned himself near the fireplace where a natural cluster of aunts, uncles and older cousins had gathered, and he did it with the casual ease of a man who had spent decades understanding how to occupy the center of a room without appearing to. I want to say something while everyone's here, he said. His voice carried the specific gravity of someone making an announcement they have been reluctant to make. Several conversations stopped. I know some of you may have heard that Quinn and I have been going through a difficult time. She's had a hard year. The accident was serious and I think it affected her more than any of us realized. He paused, his expression composed into the shape of concerned fatherhood. We love her. We've always loved her. And whatever she's been feeling, whatever she thinks happened, I want this family to know that Marlene and I have only ever wanted what's best for her. My mother, perfectly positioned at his elbow, pressed the handkerchief briefly to the corner of her eye. An uncle across the room made a sympathetic sound. 2 cousins exchanged a glance. The narrative was working exactly as Delia had predicted it would. The room was being carefully tilted before the conversation even officially began. I was sitting on the far side of the room and I did not react. I watched Delia catch my eye from across the fireplace and give the smallest possible shake of her head, which I understood to mean exactly what Walter had told me on the porch. Let them talk. Let them set up whatever they're planning. The documentation doesn't change. My father looked across the room at me with an expression calibrated to look like an olive branch. Quinn, I hope tomorrow we can sit down as a family and work through this properly. Whatever misunderstandings have happened, we're still your parents. That doesn't just go away. Every person in that room looked at me. 30 people, most of whom had known my father for decades and had heard his version of events in some form over the past several weeks through phone calls and casual check-ins and the quiet groundwork he had been laying since the moment the mortgage transfer stopped. The room was weighted. He had made sure of that. I looked at my father for a long moment. Then I said, "Sure, Douglas. We can talk in the morning." I used his first name deliberately, and the slight stiffening in his posture told me he noticed. Marlene blinked. Ivy, who was standing near the hallway, looked at me with an expression I could not immediately categorize. Walter, who was in the corner armchair with his glass of water, allowed himself the smallest possible curve at the corner of his mouth. Then he set down the glass and excused himself to bed, moving through the room with the calm authority of a man who had decided everything that needed to be decided and was simply waiting for morning to prove it. I got the boys settled in the small bedroom Walter had prepared for us, 2 sleeping bags on a rug beside a narrow bed, a nightlight plugged in near the door. Owen was asleep within minutes. Eli lay on his back looking at the ceiling with those thoughtful eyes of his, and after a while he asked me if we were going to go home tomorrow. After the party, I told him. Is it going to be a good party? I smoothed his hair back from his forehead. Yes, I said. I think it's going to be exactly what it needs to be. He accepted this without further questions, the way 4-year-olds sometimes accept things that adults would spend hours dissecting, and closed his eyes and was asleep before I reached the door. I stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the muffled conversation still coming from the living room below, my father's voice occasionally rising above the rest with the easy confidence of a man who still believed tomorrow was his to control. I thought about the binder sitting on Walter's desk in the study where I had watched him place it earlier that evening. 2 inches of paper. 7 years of transfers. Every date, every amount, every receipt. 38 years on the bench. He had told me himself. He knew what happened when facts were laid out somewhere people could not walk away from. Tomorrow this family was going to find out exactly what that meant. Morning came in slowly through the curtains of the small bedroom, thin October light falling across the sleeping bags on the floor where Owen had migrated sometime in the night and was now sprawled at a 45-degree angle with one arm thrown over his face. Eli was already awake, sitting up quietly and watching the light move the way he always did in the mornings, like a small person who had decided that the first few minutes of every day belonged to observation rather than noise. I had barely slept. Not from dread, exactly, but from the particular alertness that comes when your body understands that something significant is about to happen and refuses to waste it on unconsciousness. I got the boys dressed and took them down to the kitchen where Walter was already at the stove making eggs with the methodical efficiency of someone who had been cooking for himself for a long time. He did not say good morning in a way that required a response. He just handed me a mug of coffee and pointed at the table, and that was enough. We ate quietly while the house slowly came back to life around us. Footsteps overhead, the sound of a shower running somewhere down the hall, voices drifting in from the back porch where someone had started a second pot of coffee on the outdoor burner. By 9:30 the house was full again. 30 people in various configurations of wakefulness and conversation, plates of leftover birthday cake on the kitchen counter alongside fresh biscuits that Aunt Patrice had produced from somewhere, the boys running circuits through the downstairs rooms with 2 cousins who had designated themselves jointly in charge of a mission that involved a great deal of shouting. My father was in the living room holding court in the armchair nearest the fireplace, looking rested and confident, which told me he had slept well, which told me he believed last night's performance had landed the way he intended. My mother was in the kitchen helping clean up, which was unusual enough that I recognized it immediately as strategic positioning. Marlene Tremblay did not clean up voluntarily at family gatherings. She was making herself visible in a particular way, the helpful present mother, establishing a visual counter-narrative before the conversation even began. Ivy was on the back porch with her phone and a mug of coffee, not talking to anyone, with the look of someone replaying a conversation from the night before and not entirely liking how it sounded on second review. Walter came to find me at 9:45. He appeared in the doorway of the small sitting room where I had retreated after breakfast, and he looked at me with those clear gray eyes and said simply, "It's time." He had the binder under his arm. He had retrieved it from the study sometime that morning without my needing to direct him to it, which told me he had been thinking about the order of this for longer than just last night. He walked into the center of the living room and stood there, and within 30 seconds the room had reorganized itself around him the way rooms always reorganize themselves around Walter Tremblay. It was not something he manufactured. It was the accumulated gravity of a man who had spent 4 decades being the person in the room that decisions deferred to, and it did not diminish just because he was standing in his own living room in Harlan County rather than behind a courtroom bench. People drifted in from the kitchen and the porch without being summoned, the way people do when someone with real authority simply occupies a space and waits. Walter waited until the room had fully settled. Then he looked around it slowly, the way a man looks at something he has been thinking about for a long time and is finally ready to address directly. "I've been a judge for 38 years, he began. In that time the most important thing I learned is that the truth does not require decoration. It does not need arguing. It simply needs to be presented completely and accurately and then allowed to do what the truth always does when it is given sufficient room to operate." He paused, and in the pause the only sound in the house was the fire and the distant noise of children somewhere upstairs. "So that is what I intend to do this morning. I am going to present facts to this family. Not my interpretation of events. Not anyone's feelings about those events. Facts. And I am going to ask that everyone here simply listen until I have finished. He opened the binder. 7 years ago, Quinn used a portion of her first engineering salary to set up a recurring bank transfer to cover the mortgage on her parents' house in Briarwick. He turned a page. $2,200 per month. Every month. For 7 consecutive years. He looked up from the page and let the silence hold for a moment. That is $184,800 in mortgage payments alone, paid by a woman who was not on the deed and was never asked whether she was willing to make this a permanent arrangement. The room was quiet in a way that was qualitatively different from the quiet of a moment ago. It was the dense, recalibrating quiet of people updating their understanding of something they thought they already knew. 5 years ago, Douglas's employer restructured their benefits and eliminated dependent health coverage. Quinn contacted the insurance provider directly and added both of her parents to her existing policy. She did this without being asked, and she did not tell them she had done it. $840 per month. For 5 years. He paused. $50,400. My father had not moved from the armchair, but his posture had changed in the way that postures change under load, everything redistributing quietly while the exterior tries to hold its shape. Vehicle repairs over the same period, home maintenance, 2 emergency plumbing situations, a partial roof replacement. Combined total, $31,200. Walter continued at the same unhurried pace that made every number land with its full weight. Direct financial support transferred to Ivy at Ivy's request across a 4-year span. $11,000, provided in increments that were individually small enough to seem casual but collectively substantial. He turned to the final tab. Total documented financial support from Quinn to members of this immediate family over 7 years. $311,400. Provided while she was completing professional licensing requirements, managing a full-time engineering career, and raising twin boys without a partner. He set the binder flat on the coffee table. The sound of it was very small in the room. Now I want to address what happened 8 weeks ago. He looked directly at my father. Douglas Tremblay was not a man who looked away from things, but in that moment he came close. Quinn was in an ambulance. She had a lacerated spleen and internal bleeding significant enough that her attending surgeon later told her that another 20 minutes without intervention would have materially changed her outcome. From that ambulance, holding a phone with blood on the screen, she called her father and asked him to go to her house and be with her 4-year-old boys until she understood what was happening to her. Walter's voice did not change. It simply continued, even and precise and completely without theater. Douglas told her she was being dramatic. Then he ended the call. There was no return call that evening. There was no call to the hospital that night or the following morning, or in any of the 4 days she was admitted. There was no visit. The first contact came 5 days after the accident, when the automatic mortgage transfer did not arrive. The sound that came from somewhere in the room was not a word. It was the sound a room makes when 30 people simultaneously process something that reframes everything they thought they understood about a family they have known their whole lives. My father stood up. There is context here that is not being represented, and I think before this conversation goes any further. Douglas. Walter's voice did not rise. It simply closed. It stopped my father's sentence the way a gavel stops a courtroom, not with force but with the absolute and unambiguous authority of someone who controls the terms of what happens in the space they occupy. Sit down. My father sat down. I watched it happen, and I watched the room watch it happen, and something shifted in the atmosphere that I did not have an immediate word for. Walter turned to me. His expression had not changed once throughout all of it, steady and clear, giving nothing away except certainty. Quinn, he said. Is there anything you want to say to this family? I stepped forward. I did not come here to humiliate anyone, I said. My voice was even, and I was grateful for that. I came because my grandfather asked me to, and because I am done living inside a version of this family that requires me to pretend the evidence does not exist. I looked at my parents. I never needed gratitude. I never needed acknowledgement. What I needed, just once, was to matter as much as what I was providing. And the night I was bleeding in an ambulance and asked for 2 hours of help with my children was the night I got a clear and definitive answer about whether that was ever going to happen. My mother pressed the handkerchief flat against her mouth. My father looked at his hands. I am not done with this family, I said. But I am done with this version of it. The one where I fund and support and give and ask for nothing. And in return I am managed and sidelined and called dramatic when the cost of my absence finally becomes inconvenient. I paused. That version is finished. What comes after it is up to all of us. Walter picked up the binder from the coffee table and set it on the mantelpiece above the fireplace, where it sat in plain view of the entire room. 2 inches of paper. 7 years of transfers. 38 years of a judge knowing exactly when and how to present what was true. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. And in that held silence, something that had been standing on a foundation it was never meant to stand on for far longer than it should have been allowed to stand finally came down. The room stayed suspended in that silence for what felt like a long time but was probably less than a minute. Then Aunt Patrice, who had been standing near the doorway with her arms crossed throughout the entire thing, walked across the room and stood beside me. She did not say anything. She simply stood there, and something about that single deliberate movement broke whatever hold the silence had on the room and things began to shift. An uncle named Carl, my father's younger brother who had driven up from Bowling Green the day before, turned to look at Douglas with an expression that had none of the diplomatic ambiguity that had characterized most of the room's reactions. 7 years, Doug, he said. 7 years and you called her dramatic from an ambulance. My father opened his mouth and closed it. Carl shook his head slowly and turned away, which was in some ways more damning than anything he could have said next. My mother was crying properly now, not the managed performance from the night before but something rawer and less controlled, her shoulders shaking in a way that would have moved me once and now simply registered as real. I did not approach her. I did not know what I would do with my mother's grief yet, whether it was grief for what she had done or grief for the version of events she could no longer maintain, and I was not ready to find out in the middle of a room full of people. Ivy had come in from the back porch during Walter's presentation and was now standing near the kitchen doorway with her arms wrapped around herself in the particular posture of a person who has been told something they already knew somewhere underneath the performance of not knowing it. She was not crying. She was looking at the binder on the mantelpiece with an expression that contained something not purely defensive, which was different from anything I had seen on her face the night before. My father left the room without speaking to me. He walked out through the hallway and I heard the front door open and close, and through the window I watched him walk to the far end of the porch and stand with his back to the house, looking out at the hills. He did not look like a man who had just been publicly humiliated, or not only that. He looked like a man trying to locate himself in a version of his own life that had just been substantially revised. I did not feel satisfaction watching it. I had expected to. What I actually felt was exhausted sorrow, the feeling of something that should have been simple being far more complicated than it ever had any right to be. Walter found me in the kitchen 20 minutes later. The room had thinned out as people drifted into smaller conversations or outside into the pale October morning. He poured himself a second cup of coffee and sat down across from me without preamble. "How are you?" he asked. "Tired," I said. "The right kind. The kind that comes after something is finished rather than before." He nodded. "Your father will need time. Douglas has built an identity around being the patriarch of this family, and what happened this morning dismantled a significant portion of the architecture that identity was resting on. Men like that do not reckon with themselves quickly." He paused. "But they do reckon. Eventually. And if he doesn't? Then you will know that with certainty rather than suspicion," Walter said. "And certainty, even the painful kind, is more useful than a question you keep carrying without an answer." He set down his mug. "You are 36 years old with 2 healthy boys and a career you built entirely on your own merits. Whatever your parents decide to do next is their decision. Your life is not contingent on them making the right one." I looked at him and thought about the years of distance my parents had constructed between us, all the visits that were always too inconvenient. "Why did you let them keep you away from us for so long?" I asked. Not with accusation. Just the plain question I had been carrying since he first called me 3 weeks ago. He was quiet for a moment. "Because I trusted my son more than the evidence in front of me. And because it is easier when you are old and your family is scattered, to accept the version of events that requires the least disruption." He looked at his hands. "I was wrong. I understand that I was wrong and that it cost you something I cannot give back." "Thank you for saying that," I said. He nodded once. the nod of a man who considers something acknowledged and does not require it to be processed further, which was so precisely the right instinct that something loosened in my chest I had not realized was still clenched. My parents left before lunch. My father helped my mother with her coat and walked past me in the hallway without stopping. Then he paused with his hand on the door frame, his back to me. He stood there for several seconds. Then he said quietly to the door frame rather than to me, "I didn't know it was that serious." It was not an apology. It was not even close to an apology. But it was the first thing he had said that did not contain a defense inside it, and I filed it away in the same place I filed all incomplete things. "I know," I said to his back. He went through the door. Ivy left an hour after our parents. She found me on the back porch where the boys were playing in the yard below, having repurposed 2 of Walter's old gardening stakes into swords without anyone's authorization. She stood beside me at the railing and we watched them for a while without speaking, and the silence between us was different from any silence Ivy and I had shared in recent memory. Less defended. Less arranged. "I didn't know about all of it," she said finally. "The mortgage, the insurance, I genuinely didn't know the scale." She paused. "I'm not sure that makes it better." "It doesn't," I said. "But it's a different thing than knowing and not caring." She absorbed that. "I'm going to pay you back," she said. "The money I took. I don't know how long it'll take, but I'm going to." "You don't have to," I said. "I know I don't have to." Her voice was quieter than I was used to from Ivy, stripped of the confidence that had always served as both armor and performance. "I want to. Because I need to be someone who does that." She looked down at the boys in the yard. "They're good kids." "They are," I agreed. She left without anything more being resolved between us, because nothing more could be resolved in a single conversation on a back porch in October, and we both understood that. But she left differently than she had arrived, and I held on to that distinction because it was real and because it was the kind of small, true thing that matters more than it initially seems. The kind of thing you return to later when you are trying to figure out whether repair is actually possible or whether you are simply hoping it is. I drove home to Briarwick in the late afternoon with the boys asleep in their car seats. The binder was in my bag on the passenger seat. Walter had returned it to me before I left, and I still had not decided what to do with it. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps it had already done everything it was ever going to need to do. I recalculated my monthly budget properly and without guilt for the first time in 7 years. The $3,040 that had been leaving my account every month now went into a dedicated savings account for Owen and Eli. A college fund that would grow quietly in the background of their childhood. It felt like the right kind of arithmetic, the kind where the numbers finally pointed somewhere worth going. 6 months after the gathering, my father called on an ordinary Tuesday evening. Just his name on my screen. I let it ring twice and then I answered. He did not have a speech prepared, which told me this call was different from everything that had come before. He said my name. He said he had been thinking. He said he was sorry, plainly and without the architecture of justification built around it. It was not a resolution. It was not enough on its own. But it was a first step on a foundation that would need to be constructed carefully from the ground up, with both of us paying genuine attention to what it was actually resting on this time. I told him I heard him. I told him I would think about it. Then I told him about the boys, about Owen's latest scheme and Eli's new habit of organizing everything by color. And for a few minutes we talked about my children like two people who had made a quiet decision, without any guarantee of the outcome, to try. I did not know what the next year would look like. I did not know whether my parents would do the difficult work of becoming people capable of a different relationship, or settle back into old habits and hope that time would accomplish what accountability had not. What I knew was simpler than any of that. My boys were asleep down the hall. My grandfather called every Sunday and spoke to them with the unhurried attention of a man who understood that the most meaningful thing he could do at 82 was be present for the people who would remember him. And I was no longer carrying a weight that had never belonged to me. That was enough. For now, that was exactly enough. If this story made you feel something, don't just scroll away. There are so many stories out there that never get told, and here on Confira Stories we bring them to life. So if you enjoy emotional, real-life drama like this, take a second to subscribe and be part of the journey. And if you've ever been in a situation like this, or have a story of your own, share it in the comments. I read them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.